Lanka became independent in 1948, and in the first few decades, we had some notable achievements. And then some significant setbacks in more recent decades. This picture is largely a reflection of changes in development policies. Long periods of violent, ethnic and other conflicts, and increasing inequalities in income, education and health in recent decades. COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis over the last few years has made the social and economic crisis social and economic conditions worse, resulting in increasing poverty and vulnerability of lower segments of the population. No doubt with an adverse impact on the state of social development in the country. I have an outline for my presentation. Early social legislation that prepared the ground for a higher level of social development. In other words, we have had some significant social legislation in the first decade or so after independence. Achievements in social development in the decades following political independence in 1948. Economic liberalization and its impact on social sectors. That's the last 45 years or so. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic and the unprecedented economic crisis. And that led to increasing poverty and vulnerability. More recent developments, we can look at not just poverty but multidimensional poverty. There is a multidimensional poverty index that has been developed by the Census and Statistics Department, and then MVI, Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, developed by the UN. I have been part of that initiative in 2023. And then state responses over the years, and we have moved more and more into a centralized system, and the need for a community-based monitoring and intervention system is the need of the hour. That's the outline of my presentation. I'm going to spend a bit of time on each one of these. Now, in 1939, even before independence, in Sri Lanka, we introduced universal free education. Universal free education. That was revolutionary, and that had a huge impact. Most of us are here in this room because of that 1939 education bill. I don't want to go into that, but I think that is really a fact. So it was so powerful, creating equality of opportunity in education. And then we had in 1942 Land Development Ordinance to address the problem of landlessness. As you know, population was growing, and then the way the land was concentrated in the hands of big landowners, and then of course various institutions, including religious institutions, that really created a lot of landlessness across the country. You know, our population was growing very rapidly, and so 1942 introduced this legislation, which was really to reverse the trend that was really, you know, reinforced by a legislation that was introduced by the British in the mid-19th century. So public land was made available to landless people across the country. That really relieved the economic pressure on low-income families. And then 1957 we had to introduce Employees Provident Fund legislation. That was a kind of a pension scheme. In other words, it is a contributory system, and the employer and the employee had to contribute, and when you retire, you get a lump sum which you can do whatever you like with, but you can of course draw the interest, and then you can actually live on that. Now that's what I'm doing now. Now, besides the above legislative intervention, post-independence governments in the first few decades took various policy measures to improve living conditions in rural areas where the vast majority of the people live. These included rural infrastructure development, improvement of health and education services, provision of subsidized food, and public transport. That was a very, very important development. And then of course the establishment of rural industries. So there were many more, but I just noted down certain things that are very important. Now, in terms of achievements in social development, the cumulative impact of the interventions mentioned in the last slide resulted in a higher level of overall social development in the country. This was evident from the very high rate of literacy in the country, near universal literacy. This was evident from, not only literacy, and then very high life expectancy in comparison to the countries in the region, low child and maternal mortality, and a high level of human development index. Yet increasing population and the lack of a rapid expansion of the formal sector of the economy resulted in a very large informal sector, providing irregular employment and insecure income to a large proportion of the population in the country. So that's basically in a nutshell. I just give you some data that illustrates what I'm saying here. As you can see, life expectancy. This is a snapshot, and then expected years of schooling going up, mean years of schooling going up, then per capita income, and then human HDI value, human development index value, as you can see. Then Sri Lanka's performance with respect to key MDGs. Again, the same kind of story. As you can see, we have had significant improvements in universal primary education, 99.9, almost 100%. And extreme poverty, of course, has been reduced during that period. And gender ratio in primary enrollment almost equal. And then child mortality gone down. Maternal mortality again has gone down. And then of course there are also indicators like forest cover being reduced, and that is partly because of population growth and distribution of land. Now, sectoral distribution of labor, as I already mentioned, the informal sector has expanded rapidly, and as you can see, we have formal sector employment in the public and private sector at a very low level. So the point is that when it comes to employment-based social security, you have only those in the formal sector having access. Let's say employees' provident fund and the pension. Pension is only about 5%, and then of course employers' provident, both together about 27%. So you have nearly 3/4 of the the people, employed people, not having access to formal. So in other words, they are left out of social protection, employment-based social protection. Then comes, this is really the story that has been unfolding from the time of independence until recent decades. But then when you look at what happened after the change of economic policy in 1977, there has been increasing inequality, not just in income distribution, but also in terms of inequality in education, inequality in health. I mean, I have no time to go into these things, but if you take education, we started with universal free education. In other words, wherever you were, you had access to education. But whereas today we have a highly unequal education system. On one hand, you have still very backward rural schools, and then you have in Colombo so many international schools. So the point is the gap between rural disadvantaged schools and international schools, it is sky high. So then the same with health. I don't want to take too much time. And then poverty and inequality. Income distribution has worsened, and it continues to remain, very, very unequal. And then migration. Sri Lanka, basically has been sending migrant workers to the Middle East, now of course to almost all parts of the country. East Asia, Japan and all these countries are attracting a lot of our migrant workers. And then of course they go to almost every country, like to go to Italy, there are so many, and then Europe, and so on. So the migration of labor now, of course this has economic gains, because this is really the biggest source of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka. Biggest source, $7.5 billion US. Compared to all the other areas, like we are exporting garments, we have tourism, and we have we have also tea. We are exporting tea. Now, if you take each one of these, much lower compared to remittances, inward remittances. Now, so anyway, naturally it is attractive to people who are really under economic pressure. So, and many people go overseas to earn money and send back so that their families can live a decent life. I don't know whether it's a decent life, but anyway, but the point is that they have money to send their children to school, build a house, and so on and so forth. And the informal sector, I think expansion, is a major thing. It amounts to about 60% of the working age population. That's really, now informal sector, I don't have to tell you. They are casual workers with no employment security, no, let's say, provision for old age pensions, no, let's say, employment security, income security, and so on. Now, this is about income inequality. This is from 1991 to 2019. Now you can see the income distribution. You can see the income deciles. The first one, second one, and the third one, 10th one. You can see the 10th one, and it's about first decile, that first 10% of the income earners earn 2% or less of national income. First 10. Whereas if you take the highest decile, it's over 35%. And between, you take the last two deciles, it's over 55%. So the income distribution has been consistently highly unequal, and you can imagine what this would mean for social development and social protection. And trends in migration, as you can see, before economic liberalization, we had 524 people migrating for work. Now later on, of course, the numbers have increased. The last one that I have here is 2015. Now it is, of course, much more, over 300,000, 263,000 people migrating for work in that particular year. So it's of course cyclical migration. Some people come back and go again, but then there are new people going in as well. So the point is migration, now the impact of this on the economy, because you create a hiatus in the labor force. You have a deficit in many areas, and then naturally the wages go up. In rural areas, when the wages go up, naturally cost of production goes up, and the farmers basically give up farming. Then you can imagine the impact of that on agricultural production and the increasing dependence on imported food and so on and so forth. This is about trade deficit. I mean, the gap between imports and exports has been widening, and the trade gap has been filled largely by using remittances. Remittances accounted for about 70% of the trade gap. So in other words, Sri Lanka became an import-dependent country in almost every area. For instance, our industrial base was eroded after economic liberalization, and therefore we had to import almost all the industrial goods that we needed in almost all the sectors, like all the transport equipment, all the equipment that you need, medicine equipment and so on in the health sector, and then in the educational sector, and then energy sector, and then households, basically sort of buying a lot of the industrial goods and so on and so forth. So the point is that import dependence has increased, and that's another major thing. And this is about the social security coverage. I already mentioned this. I'm not going to say anything more on that. You can see government pensions, which some of us are entitled. That's only about 6.5% of the people. And then you have employees' provident fund. That's only 14%. And then you can see, these other pension schemes that were introduced in more recent years, they have really not worked out, and therefore they are not really very effective, like farmers, fishermen, and self-employment, and so on. So the point is that only social security, social, let's say pension, and social, this formal provident fund, coverage is only less than 28%. So all the rest, now this particular, as much as income, this is also a very critical factor impacting on the well-being of people. Now, labor force participation, now we were talking about elderly in the previous presentation. In Sri Lanka, elderly people can't stop work. They have to continue to work because they don't have any fallback option. Because they, if you have a pension, you don't have to go to work. If you have savings like provident fund savings, you don't have. But whereas when you don't have, you have to earn an income. Especially if you are in the informal sector, you have to continue till you drop dead. So this is where you have, let's say you can see 60 is the retirement age in the public sector. You can see, there you have a very high proportion of people working, and 65 to 69 and so on and so forth. So the the older people have to continue to work because they don't have any pension or savings, and then of course their situation is not so good. And as you move around in Colombo, you will see a lot of elderly people either working, doing something, cleaning or whatever, or they are just holding their farm at you. So either is, both are not so good for their well-being. Okay, then came the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis, and that made the situation, of course, worse because it had an impact on income and employment, impact on education. During the COVID period, as you can remember, digital divide, which is very much there in Sri Lanka, is only about a third of our people are online. They have access to internet based services, and therefore digital divide is very much there, and it is particularly so among older people, but also of course poorer households and so on. And then income and employment situation got worse, and poverty increased, and the multidimensional poverty vulnerability index shows also clearly that more and more people are vulnerable. If you take poverty situation, poverty has increased to 27% of the households. 27% of the households, but of course it is much more. It is much more now because of. And then if you look at the multidimensional vulnerability, which also includes poverty, there is about 56% of the households. So it's a very large proportion of the population. So I was part of the development of this vulnerability index, and we realized that people are vulnerable to many situations. Like for instance, climate change is really impacting very much on vulnerable people, living in marginalized kind of areas like in the mountainous areas, and then low-lying areas, coastal areas, and so on and so forth. And when they are exposed to extreme weather events, their situation gets really bad. So disasters appear to be one of the key areas that impact increases the vulnerability. And then of course deaths, household debts, that's a major source of vulnerability. And so unemployment and poverty, and all these are all factors that contribute to vulnerability. And then you have 56% of the households being classified as vulnerable, multidimensionally vulnerable. And I already mentioned about climate change. Now the state response, we have had a fairly centralized system of administration. We have a public administration system, and it goes down to from the center to the periphery to villages. But the point is that it is hierarchical, and it's basically a one-way street. Like it's really authority flowing down, and there's very little kind of feedback. There's hardly any feedback. So as a result, lot of the institutions function at the center, in Colombo, and we have various institutions in Colombo in charge of various areas that we have already touched on, including elderly population welfare. We have Child Protection Authority for Children in Colombo, we have Elders Secretariat in Colombo, we have Climate Change Secretariat in Colombo. I don't know if it is functioning now, but and so on and so forth. So the point is that the gap between the center and the periphery is so vast, and that has to be bridged. And I have basically argued that we really have to bridge this gap. How to bridge that gap? The need for the establishment of a community-based monitoring and intervention system to ensure all families and individuals are reached, have equitable access to public services, including targeted interventions such as income support. Such a system can be easily established with the existing administrative infrastructure and the trained human resources in all parts of the country. The trained social workers can help with the prevailing wide gap between the households on the one hand and institutions on the other, providing diverse services at local level. I don't want to go into this, but I just want to leave it there so that you can start thinking as well. Concluding remarks, Sri Lanka achieved remarkable progress in social and human development thanks to early state interventions in almost all sectors, not only in social security, but in health, education, rural infrastructure development, rural industries, and so and so, agricultural modernization and so and so. But in more recent years, we have had some setbacks in the above regard, and these setbacks have overshadowed early gains, often resulting in diverse economic, social, cultural, and environmental consequences. Yet, evidence-based social policies, if adopted, can bring about desirable change and improve the life chances of people in line with sustainable development goals and much needed climate change adaptation to avoid catastrophic impacts of the worsening climate crisis. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for giving a patient hearing, and I do not know where we are heading from now on, but I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.